There is a beauty that ordinary eyes cannot see, hidden behind the prejudices that people carry as heavy burdens in their souls. Thomas Mitchell walked down the main street of the Cedar Valley, holding the small hand of his 6-year-old daughter Emma. The afternoon sun painted the dust, dancing in the warm air golden, while the horses' hooves echoed against the beaten earth. It was a day like any other in this small western town, until the whispers began. At the door of the church, Margaret Sullivan adjusted her white veil over her brown hair that shone like honey in the golden light. Her green eyes reflected a mixture of nervousness and joy as she waited for the moment to walk down the aisle where James Crawford was waiting for her. She wasn't thin like the other girls in town, but there was a natural grace in every movement, a delicacy that transcended physical appearances. Thomas watched as some residents huddled in the shadows of the wooden buildings, pointing discreetly in the direction of the church. The words reached his ears like thorns carried by the dry desert wind. Malicious comments about the bride's appearance spread through the crowd like fire in dry straw. Emma let go of her father's hand and ran towards the wooden fence that separated the church from the main street. Her blue eyes, an inheritance from her mother who had left 3 years earlier, fixed on the figure of the bride, with pure and innocent admiration. There was something about the way the girl watched Margaret that touched Thomas's heart deeply. The warm wind carried the scent of the wildflowers Margaret had chosen for her bouquet, mixed with the scent of wood parched by the relentless sun. The simple church, built of pine planks and painted white, stood as a beacon of hope in that barren setting. The bells began to toll, announcing that the ceremony was about to begin. Thomas approached his daughter and noticed how she smiled as she watched Margaret. There was no judgment in that childish gaze, just a genuine appreciation for the beauty he saw before him. It was a silent lesson in how a child's pure heart can see beyond the imperfections that adults insist on highlighting. People continued to gather around the church, some with genuine intentions of celebrating the union. Others moved only by the cruel curiosity of witnessing what they considered a spectacle. Thomas felt a restlessness growing in his chest, as if a storm was approaching on the distant horizon. Margaret took a deep breath and took the first step toward the church door. Her white shoes gently touched the wooden floor, while the fabric of her dress whispered like dry leaves in the wind. There was a quiet determination in his posture, as if he had prepared himself to face much more than just a wedding ceremony. Emma continued to watch, fascinated as a group of women passed near the fence where she was. Their voices, initially low, began to rise, charged with a cruelty disguised as concern. The comments about Margaret's weight became more and more audible, as if the presence of a child was not enough to restrain their sharp tongues. Emma's face began to change. The expression of admiration gave way to increasing confusion as she processed the words that came to her. Thomas realized something was going on and drew even closer to his daughter, preparing for what he knew would come next. The moment of truth was approaching like a desert storm, inevitable, powerful, and capable of transforming everything around it. The cruel words floated through the warm air like flies around an open wound. Thomas watched his daughter Emma as she processed every mean comment that reached her ears. The girl's face twitched in an expression of confusion and sadness, as if she was trying to understand why adults talked that way about someone she considered beautiful. Margaret continued her walk toward the altar, seemingly oblivious to the whispers that surrounded her. But Thomas, with his experience as a man who had weathered storms, both in the desert and in life, could sense the almost imperceptible tension on the bride's shoulders. Her every step revealed a quiet courage, like that of a soldier marching through hostile territory. The interior of the church was decorated with wild flowers gathered from nearby town. White daisies and yellow buttercups created small arrangements that contrasted with the rusticity of the wooden walls. The benches, hand-carved by local carpenters, accommodated guests waiting for the ceremony to begin. James Crawford waited at the altar, his face radiating a genuine happiness that seemed to defy all whispered judgments outside. Emma suddenly stepped away from the fence and ran back to her father. Her small fists were clenched, and tears were beginning to form in her blue eyes. Thomas knelt beside his daughter, placing a protective hand over her shoulder. He didn't need to ask what was going on. The women's voices had become even louder and more cruel. The girl looked at her father with an intensity that surprised Thomas. There was something in his expression that he recognized, the same righteous indignation that his wife Sarah displayed when she witnessed some injustice. It was as if the mother's spirit was present at that moment, guiding her daughter's thoughts through a wisdom that transcended her young age. Across the street, the group of women had grown, their voices mixed in a discordant symphony of judgments and criticisms. They talked about how Margaret didn't deserve to wear a white dress, about how James Crawford had made a questionable choice, about how the union would be a disgrace to the entire community. Every word was like a stone thrown against the bride's dignity. Margaret paused for a moment on the church's threshold. Her right hand held the bouquet of wildflowers tighter, while her left hand adjusted one last time the veil that partially covered her brown hair. At that moment, Thomas realized that she had heard everything. The cruel remarks had come at her like well-aimed arrows, but her posture remained erect, defying every evil word with her dignified presence. Emma let go of her father's protective embrace and took a few steps towards the group of women. Thomas felt his heart race, recognizing in that movement the same courageous determination that Sarah showed when she decided to stand up for someone. The girl walked with small but determined steps, like a miniature warrior marching into a battle she knew was just. The hot desert wind carried with it the aroma of sage and mugwort, hardy plants that could thrive even in the harshest environment. It was a silent reminder that true beauty often blossoms in the places where one least expects to find it. The intense blue sky contrasted with the dark clouds that were beginning to form on the horizon, as if nature itself reflected the growing tension between innocence and cruelty. The women continued their comments, seemingly unaware of the small figure approaching, their voices intertwined in a web of backbiting that seemed to envelop the entire scene like a poisonous mist. They talked about weight, appearance, adequacy, as if they were supreme judges of other people's happiness. They did not realize that their own words revealed an inner ugliness that no mirror could reflect. Margaret took another step and crossed the threshold of the church. His shoes touched the wooden floor with a soft sound that echoed through the quiet interior. The guests turned to admire the bride, and many smiled with genuine affection. There was goodness in those faces, a comforting contrast to the cruelty that simmered outside. Thomas watched Emma get closer and closer to the group of women. He knew he had to intervene to protect his daughter from the toxicity of those people, but something made him hesitate. There was a special strength in the girl at that moment, an inner light that seemed to shine more brightly in the face of the darkness that surrounded her. The church bell chimes again, louder this time, announcing the imminent start of the ceremony. The metallic sound cut through the air like a sword, momentarily silencing the cruel whispers. It was as if even bronze was able to recognize the sanctity of the moment and demand the respect that was being denied. Emma stopped a few meters from the group of women. His small hands were clenched into determined fists, and his face reflected a mixture of courage and indignation that touched his father's heart deeply. It was the moment when innocence would meet evil face to face, and Thomas knew that nothing would be the same after that. The warm breeze carried to him the scent of the flowers of Margaret's bouquet, mixed with the scent of sun-dried wood. It was a reminder that true beauty cannot be destroyed by cruel words, just as wildflowers continue to bloom even under the most relentless desert sun. Emma stood before the group of women like a small storm about to come crashing down on the parched earth. Her cheeks were flushed with indignation, and her blue eyes shone with an intensity that made some of the ladies fall silent momentarily. The contrast was striking, A 6-year-old facing a circle of adults armed with their sharp tongues and hearts hardened by malice. Thomas watched the scene from a distance, torn between pride in his daughter's courage and concern about what might happen. He had learned, in his years riding through the Badlands of the West, that sometimes the most important battles are fought at the most unexpected moments, by people no one would have imagined capable of fighting. Mrs. Abigail Hartwell, wife of the owner of the local bank, was the first to notice the girl's presence. His eyes narrowed as he watched Emma, as if assessing a threat. At his side, Martha Stevens and Prudence Walker continued their venomous comments, seemingly unaware that they had gained an unwanted audience. Emma took a deep breath, and Thomas could see his daughter's small chest expand with the same determination he had witnessed in soldiers before they left for decisive battles. There was something about the girl's posture that echoed the quiet strength of her mother Sarah, as if the spirit of the woman he had loved was guiding her daughter's steps at that crucial moment. The wind changed direction, now carrying the sound of the organ that began to play inside the church. The soft and solemn melody contrasted dramatically with the tension that hovered outside, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. It was as if two worlds coexisted in the same space, one of celebration and love, the other of judgment and cruelty. Margaret, already positioned at the beginning of the central aisle of the church, was waiting for the signal to begin her walk down the aisle. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the bouquet, but her face maintained an expression of serenity that defied all the mean comments that had come to her. James Crawford smiled at the altar, his eyes fixed on the woman he had chosen to love, completely oblivious to the storm brewing outside. Emma took another step forward, now so close to the group of women that she could smell the heavy perfume of lavender that Mrs. Hartwell wore to excess. The girl lifted her chin with a dignity that surprised even Thomas. It was like watching a sunflower growing on stony ground, defying all odds with its mere existence. The words continued to flow from the women's mouths like distilled poison. Comments on how Margaret did not deserve happiness, on how her appearance was unsuitable for a bride, on how James Crawford would surely regret his choice. Every word was a stab at human dignity, a cruel reminder of how small people can be when they choose evil over compassion. Thomas felt a pang in his chest as he remembered how Sarah had faced similar situations during her life. She had also been tried, criticized for her choices, questioned for her appearance when the disease began to consume her body. But Sarah had never lost her dignity, just as Margaret had maintained hers in that difficult moment. Emma opened her mouth, and Thomas knew the decisive moment had come. The girl was going to speak, and her words would have the power to transform that scene of cruelty into something completely different. There was a purity to his indignation that cut through adult malice like a sharp blade piercing rotting tissue. The group of women finally noticed the girl's presence. Abigail Hartwell lowered her eyes to meet Emma's determined gaze, and for a brief moment, something resembling embarrassment flashed across her face, but it was only a flash. Soon the arrogance returned, as if she considered the idea of being confronted by a child absurd. Martha Stevens laughed, an unpleasant sound that echoed through the street like the squawking of a crow. She leaned slightly towards Emma, as if to share a cruel secret with an accomplice. It was evident that she did not understand the storm that was about to come crashing down on her and her fellow slanderers. The scent of the wildflowers in Margaret's bouquet reached Emma, carried by the warm breeze. It was a sweet and pure aroma that contrasted brutally with the toxic atmosphere created by the women's words. The girl inhaled deeply, as if she was absorbing all the beauty and goodness of that moment to strengthen her courage. Inside the church, the guests waited patiently while the last preparations were finalized. There was an atmosphere of positive expectation between them, a stark contrast to the negativity that simmered outside. It was as if the construction itself served as a barrier between two worlds, one of love and acceptance, the other of judgment and rejection. Emma clenched her little fists again, and Thomas could see the joints turning white from the pressure. The girl was gathering all her inner strength, preparing to release words that had formed in her pure and indignant heart. It was a moment that would define not only the fate of that confrontation, but possibly Emma's own character for the rest of her life. The church bell chimed once more, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to wake up the entire city to the importance of the moment. Birds took flight from nearby rooftops, as if even the animals felt the tension in the air. The sky, once completely blue, now showed clouds that slowly accumulated, promising a change in the weather that mirrored the transformation about to take place in the heart of that small community. The women continued their venomous whispers, unaware that they were about to face a force they had not anticipated, the brutal honesty and sheer compassion of a child who had decided that some things could not be tolerated, regardless of the consequences. Emma took one last breath, filling her lungs with warm desert air, and Thomas knew the world was about to change for all of them. The little warrior was ready for her most important battle. Emma raised her head with a dignity that transcended her age, and her first words cut through the air like a sharp blade through rotting silk. She talked about the beauty of Margaret's brown hair, about how it shone like golden honey in the afternoon sun, about how the bride's smile radiated a light that none of the women present could match. His words were simple, direct, but loaded with a truth so pure that it made the group of ladies retreat as if they had been struck by lightning. Thomas felt his heart sink as he heard his daughter defend a stranger with the same ferocity with which Sarah defended the wronged. The girl kept talking, her small but firm voice echoing through the dusty street. She questioned why these women spoke so cruelly about someone who was just trying to be happy, why they judged a person by their appearance when they were supposed to celebrate the love that was blossoming before their eyes. Abigail Hartwell tried to interrupt, her voice coming out higher than usual, like the screech of a rusty door. She said Emma was just a child and didn't understand the complexities of adult life. But the girl was not intimidated. On the contrary, her words became even more incisive, cutting through women's excuses and rationalizations like a hot knife through butter. Emma talked about her mother, about how Sarah had been one of the most beautiful women who ever lived, not because of her physical appearance, but because of the kindness that radiated from her heart. She told how her mother always said that true beauty comes from within, and that people who need to diminish others to feel important are the ugliest of all. His words flowed like crystal-clear water from a pure spring, washing away the moral filth that had accumulated on that corner of the city. The group of women began to slowly disperse like cowardly animals fleeing before a stronger predator. Martha Stevens was the first to walk away, muttering empty apologies as she hid behind a fan of shabby lace. Prudence Walker followed her lead, avoiding Emma's piercing gaze, as if the girl was able to see directly into her blackened soul. Only Abigail Hartwell remained, her face red with embarrassment and anger mixed. She tried once again to establish her adult authority, but Emma interrupted her with a simple and devastating question: whether she would be happy if people talked about her in the same cruel way they were talking about Margaret. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any answer. Thomas approached his daughter, placing his hand on her small but proud shoulder. Emma had grown up years in those few minutes, transforming herself from a curious child into a young warrior for justice. He gently pulled her close to him, not to protect her from women, but to protect women from the overwhelming force of truth that emanated from his daughter. From inside the church, the sound of the organ intensified, indicating that the ceremony was finally beginning. Margaret appeared in the doorway, radiant in spite of all she had endured. Her eyes briefly met Emma's, and a sincere smile lit up her face. It was a moment of quiet connection between two souls who had faced adversity with dignity. The crowd that had gathered to witness the scandal began to transform. Some people, touched by the girl's courageous words, began to applaud discreetly. Others lowered their heads, ashamed of having participated even passively in the collective cruelty. It was like watching a moral metamorphosis take place before his eyes. James Crawford left the church and offered his arm to his fiancée. His face radiated pride and love, completely immune to the judgments that had tried to tarnish that special day. Margaret accepted his arm with grace, and together they walked back to the interior of the church, where a future built on the solid foundation of true love awaited them. Emma watched the couple disappear inside the church and then turned to her father. His blue eyes still shone with the intensity of the battle he had fought, but now there was also a quiet satisfaction, like that of a job well done. She had stood up for an innocent woman, had faced injustice with courage, and had emerged victorious not by force, but by truth. Thomas knelt beside his daughter and hugged her, feeling his heart overflow with pride. Emma had demonstrated a courage that many adults lacked, a moral integrity that most people he knew lacked. She was truly Sarah's daughter, carrying within her the same flame of justice that had made her mother a special person. The clouds that had gathered on the horizon began to disperse, allowing the golden rays of the afternoon sun to bathe the city once more. It was as if nature itself was celebrating the victory of goodness over malice, of truth over lies. The air seemed cleaner, purer, as if Emma's words had purified not only that moment, but the entire atmosphere around it. Abigail Hartwell finally walked away, her shoulders hunched in defeat. She had been confronted by a child and had lost not only the battle, but also any respect she might still have among the residents who witnessed the scene. Her cruelty had been exposed to the raw light of truth, and she would have to live with the consequences of her poisonous words. From inside the church, now came the sounds of the celebration. Voices were raised in songs of joy, celebrating the union of two people who had chosen love despite all obstacles. Margaret and James were finally married, surrounded by those who truly mattered, people who were able to see beyond superficial appearances and recognize the beauty that resides in the human heart. Emma took her father's hand, and they began to walk towards the church. The girl had decided that she wanted to witness the happiness she had helped protect. Thomas smiled, knowing that his daughter had learned a valuable lesson about courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. As they walked, other townspeople approached Emma, some to congratulate her on her courage, others to apologize for having remained silent in the face of injustice. The girl accepted both compliments and apologies with the same natural grace, as if she knew instinctively that true victory lay not in recognition, but in the certainty of having done the right thing. The church bell chimes one last time, a triumphant sound that echoed throughout Cedar Valley like a celebratory hymn. Margaret and James emerged from the church as husband and wife, their faces radiating a happiness that no cruel comment could diminish. They had won, love had triumphed, and a brave little girl had been the guardian of that victory. Thomas looked at Emma and saw Sarah reflected in her blue eyes. His wife would be proud of her daughter, proud to know that she had raised a person capable of facing injustice with courage and compassion. The girl would carry that lesson for the rest of her life, knowing that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with true words born of a pure heart. The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink that rivaled the beauty of Margaret's hair. Cedar Valley had witnessed something special that day, the transformative power of a child's courage, the victory of love over prejudice, and proof that true beauty always finds a way to shine, even in the most unlikely places. Emma smiled at her father, her mission accomplished, her heart at peace. She had stood up for an innocent woman, had faced cruelty with dignity, and had proven that age does not determine a person's ability to make a difference in the world. At that moment, she was more than a 6-year-old girl. She was a warrior for justice, a defender of the oppressed, a light shining in the darkness of human intolerance. If this story has touched your heart and you believe in the power of courage and compassion, subscribe to the channel for more narratives that celebrate human kindness. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that true beauty comes from within.